He is a famous Hollywood actor, as well as Katy Perry's ex-boyfriend. Someone that surely some of you remember. But the strange thing is that almost nobody knows what he has done. Hello everyone and welcome back to Crimeland. The person I was talking about is Johnny Lewis. Johnny was born on October 29, 1983, in Los Angeles, California. He was born into a family of Scientologists. It sounds absurd, but that's not why I'm talking about him. In fact, it's unclear when Johnny left this organization. Returning to his life, oddly enough, there isn't much information available about him. Usually, when talking about celebrities, we know everything about their past, but for some reason, there's very little to find. We know that Johnny lived in Los Angeles and is the second of 3 children. He was only 7 years old when he got his first acting role. It was just a small part in a sort of safety video for elevators, but it was already something. And indeed, from that moment he was noticed and acted in several commercials, including some famous ones like Pizza Hut. Thanks to all these roles in commercials, someone realized that Johnny really had great potential. For this reason, at a young age, he managed to appear in various very famous TV series at the time. We're talking about shows like Seventh Heaven and Malcolm in the Middle. At the age of 18, indeed, in 2001, Johnny had already managed to earn a lot of money thanks to his TV appearances, enough to leave home. He then moved to his new place, right in Hollywood, still having roommates who were other emerging actors. His life continued like this for a few years, and by 2006 he had achieved enormous success. He had very important roles in series like The OC, and by 2005 he had also started a relationship with Katy Perry, the pop star we all know today. However, their relationship did not last long, but it was still very intense, to the point that the singer even wrote at least 2 songs about him. However, it ended in 2006. In 2008, then, for the actor there was a real turning point. He was chosen to play a very important role in a series that would be awarded and acclaimed, Sons of Anarchy. He played the role of Half-Sack Epps. However, despite the show making him incredibly famous and wealthy, Johnny began to worry about the direction it was taking. He felt that the series was becoming too raw and violent for him. To give you an idea, he was the exact opposite. It was becoming difficult for him to act in these extreme or aggressive scenes. Johnny loved poetry, studied philosophy, and liked staying up late drinking tea and playing chess. So, of course, the fact that he was filming increasingly violent scenes began to weigh heavily on him. After filming 2 seasons and receiving huge success, he made a difficult choice. He went to the directors and said that he would no longer act in the series. Or rather, if the spirits calmed down, he would stay, but if the violence continued, he would retire. He didn't want anything to do with that world, even though it was all fictional. The directors did not expect this at all, so they begged him to stay. He was still a very important character, but he didn't feel right. He had already made his decision, so in 2009 Johnny's character was written out. He felt good, as if he had freed himself from a huge weight, and now he could continue to be himself. He even decided not to take on significant roles in the film world. Instead, he wanted to focus on writing his first novel. A novel that would tell the story of a musician trying to dive into this cruel world. So he began asking around if anyone knew of a quiet place, a nice little house where he could concentrate on writing, where he could finally pursue his dream. His photographer told him that he knew the perfect place. It was called the Writer's Villa. Very fitting. It was a beautiful house with 6 rooms for rent, near Hollywood, and over the years it had become a sort of retreat where emerging actors would retreat to take a break. The reason it had this good reputation was its owner, a woman named Katy Davis. It is said that Katy was a wonderful person, who perfectly understood how difficult life was for Hollywood actors and knew how tiring it was to try to break through in that world. This woman always tried to stay close to her tenants, listening to them, taking care of them. She was truly a shoulder to cry on. They say that the villa was a therapeutic place, perfect for recharging and focusing on one's goals. Johnny, despite wanting to distance himself from the entertainment world, loved the idea of spending some time in this tranquil and peaceful place. So, in April 2009, he called Katy, requested a room, and she welcomed him immediately. He would be in the red suite on the second floor, and finally, he could focus on what he truly loved. Once there, Johnny told his friends that the writer's villa was fantastic, literally perfect, and Katy, well, let's not even talk about it. She was truly a wonderful person, as everyone said. And very soon, the two became true friends. A few months after his arrival in this paradise, Johnny discovered that his girlfriend Diane was pregnant. And even though this practically sent his plans to write the novel to hell, he was genuinely happy about it. He couldn't wait to become a father. So he decided to leave the villa and move in with Diane. 9 months later, on April 6, 2010, Diane gave birth to a baby girl. The delivery went wonderfully. They named their daughter Kulame, and they fell head over heels in love with her. Unfortunately, however, the love between the two parents quickly faded after the birth. Therefore, after a short time, Johnny went back to living with his family, and shortly thereafter there was a trial to determine which of the two had the right to custody of their little girl. After various confrontations, Johnny lost the case. Thus, he lost the opportunity to keep his daughter with him. This shock devastated him. However, he had to accept it. His life was what it was, and so time went on. By October 2011, he was still living with his parents, and his mind was increasingly tormented. He had even given up on the Hollywood star life and really didn't know what to do. Most likely, he was thinking he had done everything wrong, made risky and dangerous decisions. But he wanted to clear his mind, and so one day in 2011, he got on his motorcycle, set out on a trip west, and continued to ride for about 2 hours. He was heading toward the desert and likely thinking about many things at that moment. But at a certain point, it's unclear how, he lost control of the motorcycle and fell violently to the ground. Fortunately, he was quickly taken to the hospital, and no serious injuries were found. He had hit his head. The doctors conducted all the necessary tests, but everything turned out fine. After his recovery, he was sent home. But in reality, something was wrong. After that incident, Johnny became another person. I have no idea what tests were conducted on him, but no. Johnny was not healthy at that time. His father Michael recounts being practically the first to notice the change in his son. He saw him speaking incoherently, exhibiting agitated and nervous behaviors, and he began to really get scared. He was no longer his son, and he understood that the cause of this change was likely linked to the motorcycle accident. He then tried to encourage Johnny to undergo further tests, but he always refused. I guess being an adult, he couldn't be forced beyond the limit. But Michael was not the only one to notice Johnny's drastic change. His friends also sensed something strange. He even exhibited communicative discontinuity. In simple words, he spoke incomprehensibly. He said nonsensical things and had also begun to engage in rather dangerous behavior. One morning, on January 3, 2012, he went out in his pajamas and barefoot. He entered a nearby house and hit the owners with a glass bottle, triggering a very violent fight. The explanation he claimed was that suddenly, while walking barefoot down the street, he heard someone screaming in that house. Once inside, he didn't see anyone, but then the owners arrived, who understandably kicked him out. In response, he struck one of them with a bottle to the head. After this incident, he was charged with domestic violence, theft, and assault and was subsequently arrested. His father Michael was only able to see him 8 days later. This was because Johnny was doing worse in prison. He kept banging his head against the wall, tried to throw himself off balconies, continued to rave and say nonsensical things. They were even forced to transfer him to another detention center due to his suicidal tendencies. All of this was communicated to Michael, who was shocked by it. But despite the concerns and the certainty that something was wrong, the boy was released on bail. He had become a skeleton and didn't want anyone in his family to approach him. He was disturbed. He didn't want his loved ones to come near because he didn't want to hurt anyone. He felt uncontrollable. He just wanted to go back to his dark room because even the light had begun to bother him. Although the situation seemed harmful and destructive, in reality, after a few months, things seemed to improve very slowly. Johnny had inevitably changed. However, his goodwill played a very important role, as it is said that he was almost healed, and I emphasize almost, but he improved so much that his parents allowed him to move to Santa Monica by himself. However, as soon as he was alone, the problems began again. In fact, on February 10th, he was arrested once more. This time he had randomly punched a stranger inside a yogurt shop, but he was released on a $20,000 bail. Then he saved himself from drowning, as he had jumped into the sea fully clothed and was about to die from hypothermia. He was then arrested again, this time for breaking into an apartment, believing it was his friend's. Once again, he was released on bail. In short, the situation was truly deteriorating. Finally, after this latest arrest, his parents took him to therapy. To proceed with treatment, however, a traumatic brain injury needed to be diagnosed, which, if you recall, had not been diagnosed following the motorcycle accident. And once again, the specialist who examined him doubted the existence of a traumatic brain injury. Rather, he believed Johnny might be suffering from schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. So he prescribed medication for those conditions. But he, as he had always done, refused this as well. He turned down the medication, refused further examinations, and there was no way to convince him. The only way to make Johnny safe and, who knows, maybe help him feel truly secure, was to return to the writer's villa, that lovely and welcoming home where sweet Katy lived, the place where he had sought refuge to write his novel. It was, in fact, the last place where he had genuinely felt at peace. Johnny's parents greatly appreciated this idea. In fact, they realized they should have considered it earlier. So as soon as possible, Johnny packed his bags and set off for the villa. However, after a while, the inevitable happened. It was September 22, 2012. Next to this writer's villa lived a man named Dan, around 70 years old. One morning, this man was simply looking out the window. A naked young man, wearing red shoes and jeans, caught his attention. It was Johnny. He was all sweaty, as if he had just finished running. He stood there, motionless. Occasionally, he made some small movements, but after a few seconds, he moved closer to Dan's house. At that point, Dan, unaware, was watching him through the peephole. Shortly after, Dan slightly opened the door and stepped outside. The young man then said, "Hi, I'm John, your new neighbor." Dan replied, "Hi John, nice to meet you," but he said it with a rather suspicious face, as if to say, "All right, hi, what the hell are you doing?" After this brief exchange, Johnny turned and returned to the writer's villa. Dan then closed the door and thought, "Okay, that was strange, but whatever." Then he went back to his daily activities, albeit a bit puzzled. About half an hour after this scene, Dan was quietly at home when at some point he heard his wife scream. She shouted for him to come outside. So the man went out, and once outside, he saw his worried wife pointing to a spot on the street. At the point where Dan's path intersected with that of the writer's villa, something very violent was happening. Johnny was beating a painter hired by Dan to death. He was attacking him, striking repeatedly. With incredible energy, he continued to hit him again and again. He didn't stop, even though the man was already covered in blood. Dan, the 70-year-old, rushed towards Johnny and grabbed him by the shoulders. With all his strength, he tried to pull him away from the poor victim, who, in the meantime, continued to receive blow after blow. But Johnny didn't detach, he kept hitting him even while Dan held him back. Perhaps impatient, perhaps without any real reason, the young man turned and punched Dan. Amidst his wife's screams and the groans of the poor victim, it felt almost like a scene from a movie. After hitting Dan, Johnny had a blank, apathetic expression. He remained frozen like a statue, staring at the 70-year-old on the ground. And at that moment, Dan showed that he had some serious guts for a man of his age. He got up and punched Johnny. Then he grabbed a chair from the garden and broke it over him. But none of these blows had any effect on him. He remained impassive as if nothing had happened. There he was, motionless, with a vacant stare. At that point, Dan took the injured worker with him, dragged him into his house along with his desperate wife, and tried to close the door behind them. Johnny got up, ran toward Dan's house, and before the man could close the door, he wedged an arm inside. At that point, the situation became dramatic. Johnny's arm kept preventing the door from closing, but Dan, his wife, and the worker began to push with all their weight, yet the young man seemed unwilling to back down. He kept moving his arm as if he wanted to grab them and do harm. At one point, however, all three of them pulled back a little and charged against the door with all their strength. After this very strong blow, Johnny finally pulled back his arm. The three managed to shut themselves inside and hurriedly closed everything in the house: doors, windows, every crack, everything. Dan immediately called 911 and explained what had happened. Meanwhile, Johnny sneaked into the yard, hid, and then disappeared into the writer's villa. The police arrived quickly and searched the villa, but what they found inside left them astonished. Based on the reconstruction of the events, that day, after Johnny had shown up at Dan's house, he returned to the villa even more agitated than before. Katy, the owner, was on the second floor and saw Johnny arriving all sweaty. He looked absent, exhausted, and had a cold stare. As I mentioned at the beginning, Katy was a caring person who had helped many young men in the past, including Johnny. So when she saw him in such condition, she asked him what was wrong. She activated some sort of maternal instinct and approached him to comfort him, and there, for reasons unknown, Johnny lunged at Katy and beat her to death. He hit her with brutal violence. He stomped on her, strangled her, and struck her repeatedly with a hammer, crushing her skull. This attack, unfortunately, was fatal. But not content, once he took the life of the last woman who had cared for him, he sought out her cat and killed it in the same manner. Once everything was over, he went downstairs, saw Dan and his wife, and began to attack them for no reason, just as he had done previously with Katy and her cat. But when the officers arrived at the villa, they also discovered one last dramatic detail. After returning to the villa, having killed Katy and her cat, and nearly killed Dan's worker, Johnny climbed onto the roof of the building. In a theoretically accidental way, he slipped and fell, dying on impact. He was only 28 years old. Once the news spread, many people tried to explain Johnny's final madness. Many thought he was under the influence of some substance because it seemed absurd that he had suddenly taken the lives of a woman, a cat, and attempted to commit another crime in such a way, without any apparent motive. But if you have followed this story with me from the beginning, you will understand that the signs of some inexplicable madness had already been evident long before. Johnny had already done seemingly senseless things in the past, and this was nothing more than the culmination of his madness, a series of extreme actions that, sooner or later, folks, were bound to occur. Remember that he had rejected all psychological treatment, so, no matter how tragic it was foreseeable and could have been avoided. However, upon returning to the matter at hand, examinations of his body found no traces of drugs or alcohol. He was completely lucid at the time of the events. Even today, people wonder if he had indeed suffered a brain injury after the motorcycle accident. Some believe it, while others think he was experiencing untreated schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. In my opinion, beyond this, the important thing was to help him, which seems to have never been done. But what does Katy Perry think about all this? Well, the two were together from 2005 to 2006. But once she learned of the horrific massacre, the singer stated that she was devastated. A source says that their relationship partially inspired some of her songs, such as the one that got away and Circle the Drain. It seems that their connection ended because he was a troubled young man, and she couldn't help him at that time. Katy Perry had to think about her career, but despite everything, it seems she had not forgotten him. Indeed, as I mentioned earlier, she was upset and shocked by what her ex had done. Even the creator and executive producer of the series Sons of Anarchy expressed sadness over this story, but specifies that he was not surprised by Johnny's death and stated that it was a tragic end for a talented young man who, unfortunately, had lost his way.